It is a scene that plays out millions of times every single year, in nurseries all across the world. An exhausted parent is quietly watching their baby when suddenly the infant reaches up and aggressively, repetitively, starts tugging on their own ear. Instantly, the modern parental panic reflex kicks in. The parent's smartphone is already out. They frantically type "baby grabbing ears" into Google. The terrifying algorithm immediately floods the screen with absolute medical emergencies: severe ear infections, catastrophic fluid buildup, potential neurological concerns. By midnight, the terrified parent has aggressively diagnosed 3 different devastating medical conditions. Bright and early, the very next morning, they are desperately sitting in the pediatrician's office. The experienced doctor calmly takes out their otoscope. Yes looks deep into the tiny ear canal, clicks it off, and warmly smiles. It's perfectly clear. Your baby is perfectly normal. The exhausted parent immediately feels an overwhelming wave of relief, closely followed by feeling entirely ridiculous for overreacting. But the massive cultural anxiety surrounding this incredibly simple, incredibly common infant motor pattern is totally misplaced. Once you genuinely understand the staggering neuroscience happening inside that baby's rapidly developing brain, you will realize it was never an emergency at all. To successfully decode this deeply misunderstood physical behavior, you have to completely stop looking at the ear itself as a site of potential medical vulnerability, and start firmly looking at the infant brain as an incredibly massive, highly complex construction project. Specifically, though the baby is currently attempting to meticulously construct their very first internal body map. The tiny somatosensory cortex is frantically, beautifully working over time. At around 2 to 3 months of physical age, the infant successfully maps their own hands. By 4 to 5 months, they finally discover and meticulously map their own feet. And almost exactly as soon as those tiny hands can successfully reach up to the sides of their own head, the baby begins mapping their ears. From a strictly sensory perspective, human ears are absolutely fascinating biological fixtures. They possess an incredibly complex, weirdly cartilaginous shape. They have a distinct, slightly cooler temperature than the rest of the face. They are spectacularly, wonderfully graspable, and they produce incredibly interesting, muffled auditory sensations when they are aggressively tugged. What you are witnessing is simply the manual equivalent of a brand new baby deeply staring at their own fascinating hands. It is pure, beautiful body discovery. The only problem is that the specific combination of ears plus aggressive grabbing immediately universally triggers a massive, unnecessary parental medical alarm. To completely and accurately master the actual neurobiological translation of this incredibly common movement, we absolutely have to systematically bridge clinical developmental psychology with the precise, staggering structural neuroscience of the maturing infant brain. There are actually 4 entirely distinct, heavily researched neurological explanations for this singular, visually identical motor pattern. The first explanation, and overwhelmingly the most common across all healthy infants, is pure, beautiful self-exploration. Psychologically speaking, proprioceptive body mapping is the absolute most critical, foundational cognitive developmental task of early human infancy. Neurologically, this magnificent mapping process is governed entirely by the somatosensory cortex homunculus, the brain's internal, literal, physical map, which naturally and necessarily dedicates disproportionately massive, incredibly rich neural real estate specifically to the developing hands, the sensitive face, and the highly complex ears. Because these specific physical regions actively provide the richest, most complex tactile feedback to the brain, they are naturally the most frequently intensely explored by the infant. The second massive clinical explanation is intense, a painful jaw teething. Psychologically, this persistent rubbing is an innate, desperate, highly adaptive discomfort management behavior. Neurologically, the growing jaw and the delicate internal structures of the ear are deeply connected by the powerful, highly sensitive auriculotemporal nerve, which is a major branching pathway of the complex trigeminal nerve. When sharp new teeth aggressively push through the sensitive lower gums, it inevitably creates massive, highly confusing referred sensation and intense neuropathic pain radiating directly into the ear canal, which the frustrated baby frantically attempts to counter by actively applying heavy manual pressure to the outer ear. The third fascinating biological explanation is sheer nervous system fatigue and deeply necessary autonomic self-soothing. Psychologically exhausted, all frustrated infants rely heavily on continuous, rhythmic, highly repetitive motor behaviors as deeply powerful nervous system regulation. Neurologically, when the tiny infant hits a brutal wall of exhausting physical fatigue, the deeply primitive cerebellum and the complex basal ganglia aggressively, involuntarily, generate these rhythmic, deeply soothing motor patterns, like softly, constantly rubbing the sensitive earlobe, as powerful, necessary biological aids required to safely and effectively transition the frantic, overworked brain into deep restorative sleep. The final minority clinical case is actual medical ear discomfort or severe bacterial infection. Psychologically, this is a clear physiological pain signaling behavior. The critical neurological difference is found entirely in the accompanying systemic signals. A true ear infection is almost always biologically accompanied by a high, persistent physiological fever, severe bodily irritability, and destroyed sleep cycles. Isolated ear grabbing, occurring without any of these surrounding medical signals, possesses an incredibly low predictive value for clinical otitis media. The baby is absolutely not desperately fighting a devastating biological infection. They are simply acting like a dedicated inspector in a brand new apartment, eagerly pulling every single neural switch they can organically find. Understanding these four brilliantly designed neurobiological drivers is exactly how you finally stop the midnight Google panic and confidently, accurately learn to read your unique, beautiful baby. The ultimate diagnostic key in every single frustrating case is never the isolated, any specific ear grab itself. It is absolutely completely about what specifically surrounds the physical grab. If you closely observe a perfectly calm, deeply engaged baby, simply sitting quietly on the floor and aggressively pulling on their earlobe while staring thoughtfully into space, the specific clinical translation is joyous, healthy, biological exploration. If you closely observe a heavily drooling baby who is approximately 4 to 7 months of physical age, actively rubbing their ear while viciously chewing on their fist, the absolute correct translation is the intense, radiating neuropathic pain of incoming teeth. If you closely observe an incredibly tired, glassy-eyed baby deeply rubbing their ear in a steady, monotonous, rhythmic motion right before nap time, the translation is desperately needed, autonomic self-soothing. But if, and only if, you observe a completely miserable, inconsolably crying baby aggressively batting at their ear, accompanied by a hot tactile fever and total refusal to lay flat, then the translation is an actual medical investigation. The physical movement itself is fundamentally a false diagnostic friend. It looks utterly identical on the absolute visual surface, but it is completely, radically different underneath the skin. The fundamentally anxious parent who exclusively obsesses over the isolated motor grab will naturally always be terrified. The deeply confident, educated parent who patiently, meticulously watches the surrounding context will effortlessly read the baby accurately every single time. Once you absolutely successfully and deeply internalize this massive, highly complex neurological reality, you must aggressively and completely reframe this frequent infant body exploration as an incredibly vital, heavily celebrated cognitive milestone, rather than a frantic, terrifying cause for late-night medical worrying. You must completely, beautifully normalize the spectacular, profoundly adaptive behavior. The exact same brilliant, perfectly logically developing baby who enthusiastically and aggressively grabs their tiny ears today is the very same passionately curious baby who will soon enthusiastically grab their own tiny toes, fiercely pull their own fine scalp hair, deeply stick their entire heavy fist back into their own wet mouth, and meticulously, carefully explore absolutely every single wonderfully reachable biological surface of their own tiny physical body. This intense, seemingly weird physical exploration is exactly the tiny, in its brilliant somatosensory cortex successfully doing its absolute most critical, foundational developmental work, furiously building the complex, deeply integrated permanent neural map that proudly neurological says, "This is me. This is solidly physically mine. This specific physical body completely securely, flawlessly belongs to this particular aggressively growing brain." Every single experimental clumsy grab, every curious tight tug, every gentle searching physical squeeze is literally a brand new, flawlessly executed line of complex neurobiological code actively being written into the spectacular permanent bodily map. The exhausted, well-meaning, but deeply unnecessarily anxious parent who constantly nervously interferes with this beautiful, vitally necessary physical exploration out of pure, one terrifying medical anxiety is literally nervously actively interrupting the absolute most important neural construction project currently occurring in the universe. Do not ever impatiently stop the magnificent biological home inspector from doing their vital, incredibly beautiful developmental job. If you take absolutely nothing else away from this extensive, deeply reassuring clinical neurobiological deep dive, please permanently, beautifully internalize this one single, incredibly freeing rule for early parenthood. The next time you see your tiny, perfect baby suddenly enthusiastically grab heavily at their own ear, instead of frantically, desperately reaching for your bright smartphone to Google rare neurological diseases, I desperately want you to simply, smartly, patiently reach for the contextual environmental clues. Take a deep, thus calming breath. Look closely, warmly at the baby's entire facial expression. Gently, calmly check their baseline body temperature. Quietly, observantly watch the total quality of their current feeding. If absolutely everything happening in the environment, perfectly around the ear, grab confidently clinically says, "Absolutely fine," then the physical grab itself beautifully, clearly says, "I found my fascinating ear, and it is incredibly interesting to pull." Did you ever rush frantically, terrified to the busy pediatrician for a terrifying ear grab that joyfully turned out to be absolutely nothing? You are absolutely not alone. Go excitedly comment below right now and passionately share your own funny parenthood story. The incredibly powerful clinical realization here is that specific ear grabbing is absolutely just one single, all brightly lit room in the baby's massive ongoing physical home inspection. To be a truly confident parent, you must actively, deeply understand and completely normalize the full, breathtaking biological inventory. The complete, brilliant physical developmental tour successfully includes intense, aggressive hair pulling, providing massive, unexpected tactile feedback heavily from the sensitive scalp, long periods of intense, deep toe staring, finally mapping the absolute most distant, undiscovered frontier of the body map, curious genital touching during routine diaper changes, which is completely perfectly normal somatosensory mapping, completely lacking any adult sexual context. Frequent intense nose touching, locating the prominent sensitive center of the entire facial map, and profound constant finger sucking, achieving massive and critically important oral tactile sensory integration. Each of these completely wild, totally unexpected exploratory physical behaviors naturally triggers its own terrifying, exhausting, anxiety-filled, nocturnal parental worry cycle. But each and every single one is overwhelmingly, clinically completely benign and structurally incredibly important. The truly confident, educated parent who finally fully understands the brilliant neurobiological home inspection framework permanently magically stops panicking frantically at the door of each new fascinating room, and instead beautifully, warmly, simply starts happily appreciating the absolute methodical thoroughness of their spectacular tiny biological inspector. Send this exact clinical neurobiology video immediately, directly to absolutely every single brand new, terrified parent you possibly know in the entire world, because absolutely no one ever clinically tells you that healthy babies explore their own bodies exactly like tiny, brilliant scientists. And the spectacular biological investigation looks heavily alarming if you don't confidently know exactly what miracle you're quietly watching. Return one last profound, deeply clarifying, incredibly emotional time to that exact quiet, deeply familiar, peaceful nursery scene. There is the tiny, perfectly healthy, wonderfully engaged baby, enthusiastically, happily grabbing their own fascinating ear within the quiet silence of the bedroom. There is the totally exhausted, fiercely loving, sleep-deprived parent, their illuminated cell phone eagerly, anxiously half-reaching for the terrifying medical algorithm of Google. But now that you actually practically fully possess the master clinical neurobiological translation key, you clearly, finally, completely understand the staggering, brilliant, absolutely beautiful, utterly perfect developmental clinical truth of that specific quiet, mundane moment in your home. The beautifully busy, highly engaged, curious baby is absolutely entirely not in any kind of biological pain or severe medical distress. The completely beautifully focused, totally absorbed. Baby is simply actively, wonderfully at intense, hard neurobiological work, deeply, patiently exploring the absolute most incredibly complex, staggeringly brilliant physical object they have ever possibly encountered in the entire known universe. Their own completely amazing, perfectly designed physical body. Every single deeply focused, firm physical grab flawlessly magically maps a massive brand new biological territory. Every deeply curious, firm physical tug permanently, beautifully confirmed a heavy, newly formed, utterly vital neural connection in the aggressively growing sensory cortex. Every single quiet, repetitive physical exploration organically, brilliantly strengthens the foundational internal body map that will absolutely securely structurally underpin absolutely every single complex, magnificent physical action this wonderful person courageously takes for the entire rest of their incredible, deeply meaningful life. The tiny, curious baby who happily, thoughtfully grabs their own tiny ears today is actively, miraculously building the solid, reliable neurological foundation for absolutely every confident, strong adult handshake, every warm, heavily loving embrace, and every single complex, beautiful physical gesture they will ever successfully make in their entire lifetime. Keep the incredibly anxious, brightly glowing phone tucked safely and permanently away in your back pocket. Your highly intelligent, spectacularly developing baby's tiny hands are absolutely not aggressively attacking their own sensitive ears with a devastating bacterial infection. They are just happily, wonderfully, incredibly intricately introducing themselves to their very own spectacular body for the absolute very first vitally important time. Confidently, peacefully, deeply simply, let the magnificent, wonderful neurological home inspection gracefully, happily continue.